In this demo, I'm going to get you familiar with validation rules in WPF, which are objects you can create to encapsulate a rule and attach to a binding as a different way of setting up your validation. Starting point for this demo is the end of the last one. We have our work and home phone inputs. The home phone is still hooked up with an exception validation rule. We're going to hook up a WPF validation rule to the work phone. To do that, we first have to define the rule. So I'm going to add a class and call this regex validation rule. And basically what you do here is you derive from the validation rule base class of WPF. That has an abstract method called validate that you must override. And you're expected to return a validation result that indicates success or failure. And if it's failure, it includes an error string. Validate method is going to be passed in a value, the value that's being set on some binding that this validation rule is going to get attached to. And basically inside of your validate method, you have to come up with an answer of whether the value is valid or not. So there's some implied context here. In this case, we're writing a reusable validation rule based on regular expressions. Now as a starting point here, I've got the regular expression hard-coded into this rule. So really this should be a phone validation rule, not a regex validation rule, because we can't easily modify that. We'll fix that in a bit. But you can see I'm just setting up a regex, evaluating it with the match call, and if it doesn't match that regular expression, we return a validation result with a false indication, so it's not valid, and an error string associated with that. If it does match, then we just return validation result.valid result. Now let's go back over to our main window, to our work phone text box. So here's the work phone binding that was put in there through drag and drop. I'm going to remove the rest of the properties on the binding. Now the first thing to realize is that there's a different way to set a binding other than the curly brace notation of markup extensions. Anything that can be set as a markup extension like this can also be set as a nested element in XAML. So I can take out the text property here and add it in like this, where I'm setting the text property as a nested element on my text box, and the value of that property is inside of the angle brackets. In this case, an instance of a binding with its path set to work phone. So that's just the equivalent syntax there for setting up the binding. Now the reason for this is when you use validation rules, you have to set a property on the binding that cannot be done inline as a markup extension. So then we can expand the binding to allow child elements and add in validation rules. So there's a validation rules collection on a binding. Inside of that, you can add instances of validation rules. So we add an instance of our regex validation rule inside that collection. And now anytime that binding goes to set the work phone path, it's going to evaluate that validation rule and pass in the value that it was going to use. So with that in place, we could go ahead and run, and we can put the work phone into an invalid state and tab out of the field, and we can see it goes red. Get it back into a valid state, tab out, and the red box goes away. Now another thing to point out here while I'm at this point is the update source trigger property of a binding. So this is the same update source trigger that we've seen inside the curly brace notation. If we set it to property change instead of the default of lost focus, then we get more immediate feedback to the user of validation errors. So as soon as I go into an invalid state, the red box appears, and as soon as I'm back in a valid state, the red box goes away. So update source trigger, if you want immediate feedback to the user as they're typing of whether their current input is valid or not, can be a good combination when doing validation. In general, one of the problems with validation rules is the fact that there's very little context available inside of the rule itself about what you're evaluating and where it's coming from. All you get is a value here. You can think of this as if a stranger walks up to you on the street, says 42, are you okay with that? You have no context for why they're asking, where the 42 comes from, what it relates to. All you have is a value, and you're supposed to come up with an answer of is that valid or not, and if not, an error string of why not. So you really need to be able to pass some more context down into your validation rules to make them more meaningful. So one thing you can do is define properties on your validation rules. I'm going to expand my implementation here and add down at the bottom here an expression property. Now I can pass in the regular expression, making this rule really more reusable. So we got rid of the hard-coded regular expression, and now we use the expression property to formulate our regex and evaluate it. Now we could go back out to our XAML and set it when we go to use our regular expression rule. So now we set the expression based on the fact that here we have some context that we're trying to evaluate a phone, and so we come up with a regular expression that's appropriate for that phone. Obviously, if you're going to put any complex domain-specific logic into one of these validation rules, you're going to have to give it an appropriate name that indicates the nature of the rule that's encapsulated in here and what kind of value it's expected to be passed in. Whatever properties you choose to expose on your validation rules, they will have to be set with a value that's static in the XAML. Because the base class of validation rule is not a dependency object, you can't have dependency properties on it. So you can't dynamically set these properties through a binding because a binding can only target a dependency property. So whatever properties you expose will only be able to be passed static values from the XAML.